Welcome. Hi. It's the two Sarahs. We're looking at letters of intent and construction contracts this morning. I'm Sarah Fox. I run a company called 500 Words. I used to be a construction lawyer. I spent 20 years looking at construction contracts, so understand them in fairly good detail. So Sarah, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Shooter. I run a company called Shooter Consulting Limited. I'm also a construction industry lawyer. I've been around for longer than I care to remember, but pretty much around about the same time as Sarah. So I also have a pretty good handle on industry contracts. I work directly in the industry nowadays, so I'm very close to what people are actually doing day to day.
Fab. So probably the best thing to do is to start off by explaining what is a letter of intent so that we actually understand what we're talking about. So in the UK construction industry, a letter of intent is a short form letter sent to the parties to get the contract moving. It's not a letter of intent in the sense of sent to a student going to an American college to study. It's not that sort of letter of intent. It's just a really quick, easy way to start a construction project right now. It tends to be about somewhere 4 pages long, not very well drafted, but that's what we call a letter of intent. So, Sarah, do you want to explain what you mean by no contract?
Yeah, this is a bit more of a tricky one, actually. What is no contract? Well, it's quite difficult to say because it's all the things that a contract is not. It is not all the bits that a contract needs to have in order to be a legally binding contract. So it's an arrangement of some sort which doesn't have clear offer and acceptance, which are the two key bits that we need in the UK law. It doesn't have proper consideration, by which we mean the exchange of money, services and works going between the two parties or multi-parties. And it doesn't have a proper intention to be a legally binding contract. So all of those things that we need, one or more of those will be lacking.
So generally speaking, when we're talking about no contract, what we mean is when the contractor actually starts work but doesn't seem to have a paper trail that he thinks is a contract. Now, it could be that actually what they've got is a letter from the employer saying, oh, can you start now? The contract has been allowed on site. So actually the employer has already said, yes, we will get around to doing a contract, but we haven't got around to it yet. So there is some correspondence, a couple of telephone calls, often emails now, but not what anyone actually thinks of as a contract. And the difficulty is all those instructions might result in the contractor getting on the site and doing works, but it doesn't result in the contractor having any idea what they're actually allowed to do, when they're meant to start, when they're meant to stop, and how much they're going to get paid. So, Sabrin, it could be an offer letter. So it could be a letter saying, we've received your tender, you're the best price, we will enter into a contract with you, but that hasn't got there yet. So it can be an offer letter, it could be a letter of acceptance, it can be a letter of comfort, lots of different things might be no contract. And it depends. And the problem is because you need the detail, because you don't know whether or not it's a contract, it means that both the contractor and the employer have no idea what they're really bound to do, what they have to do, what they can choose to do, how much they're going to get paid. So that's what we mean by no contract. Often what a lawyer means by no contract and what a client means by no contract are two different things.
The client just wants to get on with the job, Sarah. They don't sometimes mind if they don't have a contract.
Everyone just wants to get on with the job. That's the whole problem. The whole problem is the construction industry is not very good with paperwork, but is really good with getting on with jobs. So no contract could be when nothing has been sent, offer letter, acceptance letter, letter of intent. It could be when just there's some emails, there's some pre-meetings, but it could be when there's a series of bits of paper which could be a contract if only anyone ever sat down and looked at them.
And put them together in the right way.
Yeah.
Bits that are needed.
So what's the problem with not having a proper contract, Sarah?
Well, the problem is that both parties don't really know the arrangement that they have. They think they have an idea of it. So the contractor's going on site and the employer's paying some money. But really, they haven't buttoned down the detail of who's going to do what, when it has to happen, what the pressures are, what the milestones are. Are there any gateways that have to be gone through? So they really need to know all of that before they can be certain as to what the scope of the work is and what the terms of the work are, the start, the finish, and everything else. Strikes me that there's risks in that for clients,
absolutely,
contractors.
Yeah, and as Sabrin says, if you don't have a contract, you can leave site. You are not bound to complete any works. You're not bound, if you have no contract, to complete them to any particular standard, or within any particular time period, or for any particular cost. And frankly, if the employer mucks you about, you can leave the site. The real problem is that nobody actually knows whether, in fact, they can leave the site. So although some contractors do, most of them stay and hope they're going to get paid a decent amount of money.
They do, and they hope that by getting on with it, that will engender some kind of benefit, both in kind and in actuality, from the employer, and therefore the contract will follow and everybody will be happy. And you know, it's a case of, we'll just get this bit of paper out the way and then everything will be fine. That's not really the point. Getting the bit of paper out the way is just the starting point from my perspective.
Yeah, so the real problem that we have is that no contract is a really unattractive option for both parties, because the goodwill that we think might exist doesn't necessarily exist in practice. But a letter of intent is actually not much better, because the way letters of intent are drafted in the UK, you don't have a clear scope of works, you don't have a clear price, you don't have a clear timescale, and in fact, all you've got is somebody saying, if you do some works and we never get around to the proper contract, we might pay you reasonable costs. But that's about it. So letters of intent, as the way they're drafted, actually are not much better than no contract. Many of them include a right to terminate and to chuck the contractor off the job pretty much at will.
Yeah, I think in some ways the parties are better off having no contract, because although you've got all the uncertainty of those things, the cost outcome could be more beneficial for the contractor.
Yeah, so the truth is, if a contractor is on your site carrying out works, whether or not you've got a letter of intent, you're going to have to pay for them. You're going to have to pay for those works because you're going to get the benefit of them. And even if you don't have a contract, in English law, you're going to have to pay for them.
Well, and in English law, if you don't have a contract, the contractor might be better off, because
absolutely,
because of the way that the costs will be calculated and judged by whatever the competent authority is, by the court or the tribunal.
Yeah, so, and lots of contractors know that they're better off either with no contract or with a really woolly one, because they know that they're just going to, that whatever tender price that they included was on the basis of, you know, buying the work slightly or a lesser profit. But actually, by the time they get to a no contract, or they've gone beyond the works in the letter of intent, they're just going to get reasonable sum, which could be more than they tendered for.
Absolutely. And that's why we have this big challenge, don't we, to educate clients to take proper notice of their contracts and to make sure that they spend time and invest time early in getting them sorted out. Or, if they must do letter of intent, to put in place a really good, solid one with all the things in it that we're advising them to put in it, so at least they have a basic framework for which to operate before they then spend time putting the contract together. But this kind of halfway house of having no contract, to me, is far too risky as an advisor. But clients I deal with day to day can see certain advantages to it. So it's persuading them of the merits of getting a letter of intent in place, a proper letter of intent in place, or why bother doing a letter of intent when you can spend time going straight to a proper contract? That's the chasm we have to bridge.
So one of the things that you talked about was what a good letter of intent needed, or a careful or a proper letter of intent. And the difficulty is most letters of intent, I did some research on Twitter, not the most scientific, admittedly, but 35% of people said they recycled letters of intent, and the rest of them said they used a precedent. Now, a precedent is just a posh word for a recycled letter of intent. But actually, nobody would be able to say for sure that the document they used as their base document was a decent letter of intent. They don't know what a good letter of intent looks like. So now they're recycling something which is rubbish. So there are 4 things you really, really have to have for a good letter of intent. You have to have clear parties, so who's paying and who's doing the work. That's not the hardest thing. You need a clear scope of works. Now, most letters of intent do not include a clear scope of works. They use words like preparatory works, works of mobilisation, any goods, works or services needed to keep to the project schedule. They don't have a price for those works. Most letters of intent merely say that if we don't get around to the proper contract, we'll pay reasonable costs. Well, reasonable cost, that's how long is a piece of string? That's no help to anyone.
You have no contract.
Yeah, but the other thing that you also need is time. Now, if the whole purpose of a letter of intent is to get the project moving and keep it to time, the fact that most letters of intent don't give a time scale for carrying out the first bit of works doesn't help. How can you keep a project on track if you don't have a timescale for the first chunk of work you do? There is no obligation in most letters of intent for the contractor to finish by a particular time.
No, they're more worried about the money. Do you find that, Sarah, in your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. They want to get paid a fair price for the work that they've done.
And the employer wants to put a cap on it so that they don't spend too much too quickly too soon.
Yeah. And having a contract, as Sabrin says, binds the parties together. Now, if they wanted to work together for the project because they've done through the tender process, they like their tender, they like their experience, all that kind of stuff, they like their price, why wouldn't you bind yourself properly to someone rather than just going, I'll tell you what, just come along and we'll sort it out later.
Yeah.
So what's a problem with having no contracts?
Well, the problem is the risk. The problem is that the client doesn't really know where they stand. The contractor doesn't really know where they stand, and that's dangerous for everybody concerned. What I'm interested in is really whether you can ever have an arrangement which is not a contract. I mean, clearly you can have some sort of arrangement of the sort we've discussed about already, but the courts are going to strive, if they're asked, to find that a contract exists. And they're going to look for all the things that are needed to try to put the parties in a position where they are bound to each other.
Absolutely. And one of the things we said earlier under tip 1 was the 5 things you need for a contract are offer, acceptance, consideration, intention, and certain terms. Now, consideration is anything of value. It can be a used sweet wrapper or a peppercorn. So we don't need to worry about that. Parties, we don't need to worry about the person whose site they own, the person doing the work. That's fairly clear. Offer and acceptance, well, you've got a tender process. You've already got offer and acceptance.
Yeah.
Intention is presumed. Where you've got 2 companies, intention is presumed. So the only thing we need to work out is certain terms. Well, we've said about what you need for a letter of intent, a contract. You need parties, works, price and time. But actually, only 2 of those you absolutely need, because if you don't have the price for the works or the time to complete, the law will fill them in.
Absolutely.
So an English law will imply terms into your contract to fill in the gaps. And once you've started, that's what they want to do. They want to fill in the gaps. They want to make a proper arrangement between you. So even if you don't think you've got a contract, the courts might disagree with you. So a letter of intent cannot be a contract when it's trying to be, and no contract can be a contract when it's trying not to be, because the courts don't care what you think. They care what the law says. That's it.
Well, that's right. And the courts are now quite purposeful and purposive with how they're going about industry dealings, shall we put it, in a broad sense. And I wonder how helpful that is to the industry in general. We have this, as I called it, a sort of great big chasm between parties who want to do something together but don't want to take this rather scary step of entering into contract because they think it involves all sorts of things, which actually it doesn't involve. They put together some sort of woolly letter of intent, which they think tides them over and gives them a bit of this and a bit of that, but not really anything of the real stuff that they want. Or we're jumping into full-scale, several hundred volume contracts which are put together by the best lawyers in town. So I'm quite interested in how we educate and how we talk to the smaller organizations and entities who need to understand why a contract is a good thing.
Yes, and I think as much as anything, contracts have got a bit of a bad name for themselves.
They have.
We know that loads of people do not read their contracts. Lots of consumers don't read their contracts. There's been lots of different companies who've done T's and C's. So Apple's cloud conditions apparently has a zombie clause. GameStation did one which was a Herod clause. Another company did one which was the devil clause. It took your immortal soul. So lots of people don't read their terms and conditions, and that's really clear. So contracts are beginning to get a really bad name for themselves. So when you say, would you like a contract, to most people, they kind of go, well, why would I want a contract? If I'm going to work with someone and trust them, why do I need to write it down?
Well, yeah, that's right. And you understand that position when you think about how big contracts have become and how over-lawyered they've become to some extent. What we really need to do is to try to strip back contracts into simple form that people can understand and use and read and administer themselves. I mean, there's so much in English law which is implied for you, which can be relied upon. I don't think it needs repeating. I don't think it needs adapting or changing in any way. Let's just use the law that we already have. It's balanced and it's fair and it works. I've come across a couple of clauses recently which have tried to change what is otherwise a fairly decent and fair position under law. If I was a very hard-headed lawyer acting for one party, I might push in a particular direction. But actually, when you're in industry and you're taking a more balanced view, because you want to get the project underway and people need to get on with things, then actually a big part of it is common sense.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I'm getting feedback.
Okay.
Don't know why that's happening.
Good feedback, or do you mean echoes? I think the great thing about contracts is that we can simplify them a lot. Oh, you're squeaking. That's better. Yeah, simplifying contracts. In terms of the content, we don't really need very much, do we, to make it binding and to make it work, because the law is so extensive in a number of areas already. At least in English law, we don't have to use codification as you do in other jurisdictions in order to make it work. And that's one of the big advantages. But it's also one of the scary things, because people don't really understand, because most of our constitution is unwritten, how it actually works and how it will impart an impact on the situation.
Yeah, and I think you're right. We have far too complex contracts. I've worked with somebody who got a consultant to write their letter of intent. It was 17 pages.
Ooh.
By which time you might as well just have the real contract.
You may as well go straight into a contract and do the full-blown thing.
So what would we recommend to people?
I think probably from an industry perspective, I would recommend, and this is always the case, I would recommend spending some time up front, trying to work out exactly what the project is, looking particularly at that subject matter, working out what the scope of the thing is, and what the terms of it are that we want to bind people to. Without those things, without a proper strategy, it strikes me that a lot of that time will catch up on people later on. And that's where I find in my work a lot of the disputes arise, is that lack of investment up front then causes problems later down the line.
Absolutely, and we go through all this process of tendering and everything else and deciding a strategy, and then we rip it all up.
Huge cost, and it's irrecoverable. Parties who invest in tendering can spend very big six-figure sums in tender processes with obviously no hope of getting that money back. So if you're going to do that, then let's do it properly.
So if we're going to use letters of intent, what sorts of letters of intent should clients be using?
Well, they should be using ones which are clear to start with, clear in what they expect to be done, for the money they expect to be done, and within the time they expect to be done it. And without that, there's no obligation to complete in a particular way or to a particular standard or to a particular timescale.
Absolutely, and lots of letters of intent are incredibly woolly. They seem to refer far too much to the main contract, what they would like to happen, they're future looking, but they don't actually look at what's actually happening on the ground.
That's right. And what do we want now at this point of time that we need to button down in a particular written way, which is not the main contract? The letters of intent I've seen recently have tried to pull into them all sorts of bits which you would find in a main contract. Really esoteric stuff. Important stuff like bribery and corruption, but nothing which is the immediate need right now for the parties. You got to get on site with your brickie on Monday. Yes, I'll pay you something. Anti-corruption, yes, it's important, but
not in your letter of intent. Yeah, absolutely. And the real risk with the packing letters of intent with more and more and more stuff is that people think it's like as good as the main contract.
Absolutely, but it's not, and it's not meant to be. It's meant to
be a short fix, isn't it? So it should be neat and short and focus their attention on getting the proper contract in place. That's the only thing that's actually going to help the parties.
That's right. And if you're going to spend time doing that, then get some focus on getting a short and sharp letter of intent, getting it done, and then concentrating on the main contract.
So we don't want no contract, although no contract actually sometimes helps to focus their mind that they don't actually have a contract.
No, and I've come across clients, contracting clients, who are very strategic in this way and who are actually choosing to not enter into a contract because they perceive, rightly or wrongly, that they're in a better position to not have a contract. And that's partly about how the contract is imposed upon them, how it's not balanced and it's not as fair as it should be in their eyes. Contracts have certainly been skewed. I think they've been over-lawyered. I'm putting myself out of a job, but I think they've been over-lawyered to a great extent. Contractors are actually adopting very clever ways of not entering into contracts. And that's another challenge for the industry as a whole.
Yep. It is, and maybe another challenge for another day. I know that a lawyer in London has just posted on LinkedIn about the over-lawyering of the NEC contract and how we need to avoid over-lawyering with these contracts. And one of his suggestions is a really good one, that lawyers should actually get involved much earlier in the project, because actually, if you get a lawyer involved way before you get to the letter of intent stage, they can shortcut the process and make sure you go straight to the main contract. You don't have to go via a circuitous route of this letter of intent recycled garbage that you found on your computer from several years before. I mean, to be fair, all letters of intent I've ever seen are garbage.
Not the ones that you've written, though.
No, not the ones I've written, obviously, but most of the ones that I've seen, because most people don't understand what they're meant to do. So, you know, it's a failure to understand what you need at this time to help your project.
Absolutely. And the fear that fewer the words that you have, the more problematic it is. And actually, I think my experience is that the more words you have, the more complicated it is, the more problematic it is. So keeping it simple and keeping it short is absolutely the key. Whoever that guy was who posted the comment on LinkedIn, I think he must have just read my latest article, which talks about getting lawyers into the project early and the benefits of that, and how actually a really good lawyer at an early stage, who's industry knowledgeable and all the rest of it, can help not only to shortcut that process, but to make it much more friendly to both of the parties, much more usable. After all, these guys have got to go onto the site with a big contract in their back pockets and start doing stuff with it. Sticking it on and letting it gather dust is really not the way forward, but that is what happens. So let's make contracts friendly so that people will pick them up and choose to read them and choose to use them.
Absolutely. And that applies as much to the letter of intent of making it simple and short and easy to read as it does to the actual contract that's following. Because if the contract that was following was easier to read and shorter, it wouldn't take that long to negotiate it. It would already be agreed. You would not need letters of intent. So actually, simple contracts can help you avoid the whole debate about letters of intent or no contract.
The whole thing.
So what's your vote for? Letters of intent or no contract? Which is better?
From the industry,
head on the block time.
From the industry perspective, I'd say no contract is better. From the contractors.
Yep. And actually, I think it's better for the employer because the employer, once they've sent a letter of intent, believes they actually have a contract. And they don't necessarily.
No, and they're possibly in a worse position.
Yeah.
They're neither one thing nor the other.
Yeah. Because if you're going to issue 17 letters of intent with £10 million worth of liability limiting, you might as well in that time have got a proper contract in place. And if you can't get a proper contract in place, you need to learn to walk away.
Good message.
So there it is. Don't have a letter of intent. You've put me out of a job.
You put me out of a job. There we are. It's all about risk, isn't it, at the end of the day? It's about balancing.
It's all about risk.
Helping.
Yeah. And the main risk with a letter of intent is you never sign the proper contract. You've got a contract. It doesn't matter how good it is. You've got one. Tick. You've got, your checklist of, hard hats, tick, site security, tick, tea making facilities, tick, piece of paper, tick.
Yeah. But if you don't know when, where, how, and who, then that's it. You stack.
So let's just go through some of the things that we've talked about on the string and just wrap them up. So the first thing we talked about was what is a contract, what is a letter of intent, and for a contract you need an offer, which it can be a tender, an acceptance, which can be any act, it can be email, it can be telephone, it can be a handshake, it can be letting them onto site. You need something of value, what we call consideration, but that's pretty easy. It can be a peppercorn, even if you're going to throw it away. So consideration's not. You need something called intention to create legal relations, but between two companies, you have that anyway, and you need certain terms. So you need enough for somebody else to know what they could and should be doing. But certain terms is easy because actually what you need is parties, works, price and time. There's the 4 things that you need in any construction contract. So whether or not that's a letter of intent, which is 2 pages long, or an NEC contract, which is 20,000 words, or a JCT, which is 50,000 words, those are the only 4 things you really need to focus on. But the problem is that most of the letters of intent aren't very clear about the works that need to be done, the price that's going to be paid for those works, and how they're going to keep the project to schedule, which is the whole reason we use a letter of intent in the first place. So we need to look at binding the parties together, because if we have no contract, then they can both walk away. They can stop the project at any time and walk away. And that's very, very expensive. It's not going to keep the project to schedule, and that's for sure. It's going to result in some unholy mess in front of the courts. So contracts do help to bind the parties together, but bad contracts don't. So when we say we think you should use no contract, it's because actually most letters of intent aren't a good contract. So a bad contract is worse than no contract because it messes with your head. It means we don't know what our expectations of the parties are. So if you want to bind yourself to someone, if you really want them to work on your project, get a proper contract. Doesn't matter how long it is, but get a proper contract. And the thing that we talked about was contracts, letters of intent rip up your contract strategy. Most contracts result of a tender process. The tender process was several months. The feasibility stage, the pre-contract stage may have been months, not years. And then just at the last minute, when everything else is perfect and their pyramid of cards is ready for the last card, somebody just whips out the middle layer and the whole pack of cards falls down. We end up with a letter of intent. That's not a strategy. That's like hope. That's like keeping your fingers crossed and hoping that's going to work. So you should work out what your strategy is, what you're going to do, whether you want no contract. You need to use clear letters of intent if you're going to use them at all. If you're not going to use clear letters of intent, don't bother. Don't bother at all, because you might as well focus your time that you would have spent messing about recycling a letter of intent with getting the other contract signed. That would be a better use of anyone's time, to get the real contract signed, not messing about with some 17-page letter of intent, which still says nothing useful. And the fewer the words you've got in either your letter of intent or your main contract, the easier it will be to get it negotiated and agreed and to get it out there. And that's what we need to do. We need to get people to agree proper contracts to help them to do business and to help them to get their construction project finished on time, which is the whole reason we use letters of intent in the first place. So that's a 2-minute summary of everything we've discussed. Anything else to add? Did I miss anything?
No, I think you summarised it really well, Sarah.
Excellent. So good. I think that comes to the end of our debate about letters of intent or no contract. I'm not going to tell you the answer, because otherwise people might flick just straight to the end. But the debate is worth listening to. So, Sarah, thank you very much for your time today.